The Bible, God's good book. God's first book in his book of books cuts through the inflation of human nonsense every time, guaranteed. Genesis chapter 10 through 11, though, are actually God's bridge from prehistory to history, so that man might actually find meaning with God. You see, the Bible takes history seriously, and for us, history usually falls on hard times. God knows that history actually is philosophy, and philosophy is the life that we live. So hey, come on in. Let's check out Genesis 10 and 11 together. Biblical channel. Always glad somebody shows up to actually talk about God's words, because that's the name of the game. We're only trying to, be beggars who found bread, and we're sharing it with other beggars. So we don't want to pick fights, but we do want to recognize that this world that we're living in seems to be running on empty as far as ideas go. And so we want to fill up our tanks. We want to fill up our tanks so much that we can wring out the chamois of life in the best possible way. And so what that means for us is actually going to the Bible. The Bible's the normal way that God speaks to us. And so we're just here to listen to what God has to say and to talk about it. Read the Bible, talk about it. That's what we do at the Biblical channel, and we are very glad that you're here. So share us if you want, but keep us to yourself if you want to. If you want us to help you sound like the smartest person in the room, as long as you're out there talking about God, we don't care. That's all we really want. So anyhow, Genesis chapter 10 and 11 are the genealogies section of the Bible. There's been another section of the Bible that's a genealogy, and we all know this is tough reading, but I'll tell you what, it's worth our investigation. So let's just get to it. We're not going to read the whole thing because, my goodness, that would be painful. Some of those names are really hard to say. Anywho, let's move forward. Before we move forward, though, let's just pray the way the Lord Jesus taught us how to pray. Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Deliver us from evil. That's the name of the game. We all need delivered from evil. The Bible makes no bones about that. We all need delivered from evil. So anyhow, into Genesis chapter 10 and 11 we go, and Genesis chapter 10 and 11 is going to bring us out of prehistory and into history solidly as we can understand it. So before we get there, though, let's talk about a few things. When it comes to prehistory, man's prehistory, it takes us immediately to the caveman, and God's prehistory, takes us to the civilized man. So take your pick, I suppose, but the big question is, are we like the caveman or are we unlike the caveman? Man's prehistory tells us, we're just like the caveman because we're like animals. However, God's prehistory gives us a pretty good reason to doubt our own likeness to the caveman. It's just as simple as Adam's son, the Adams, meaning Adam and Eve, their son Cain, despite his moral failings, he is a civil engineer. He built a city, for Pete's sakes. So he gets right into the civilization of life that we are quite familiar with and quite comfortable with. And so, anyhow, scientists like to play around a bit. And the scientists used to say that the Neanderthal had evolved into the sapiens, but that's not the consensus view anymore. Turns out now some scientists allegedly think that the sapiens, or the sapiens and the Neanderthals, actually coexisted with one another, and it was the sapiens that wiped out the Neanderthals, and it seems like they had a secret weapon. What was this secret weapon that they supposedly possessed? Well, the secret weapon, scientists say, that the sapiens had that the Neanderthals were crippled by was, just the simple ability to imagine reality. This is what the scientists are saying these days. Well, and apparently the power of imagined reality gave the sapiens incredible advantage on the poor Neanderthals and just simply wiped them out. And we can kind of see how that might go if the Neanderthals were not capable of imagined reality. Ooh. But imagined reality, are you kidding me? How different is that from what God says of the atoms being made in the image of God? Because the image of God, well, clearly entails the ability to imagine reality and make it reality. Well, I wouldn't be looking for a mea culpa from the scientific community, but like I said, I think the Bible gives us good reason to doubt our, direct lineage from the caveman. But Genesis chapter 10 and 11 are going to form that bridge from prehistory to history. Everything before Genesis 10 is definitely into prehistory, prehistoric, that kind of stuff. And two big names really jump out as we look at this passage, and that is Egypt and Babel, or Babylon as we would know. They appear in this text, and the Bible is right in the fact that, in agreement with the scientific community, or maybe we'll say the scientific community is in agreement with the Bible, that there are only two civilizations that span this division between prehistory and history, and that is, Egypt and Babylon. The story that we have, though, has an aim, an objective, a purpose. And these two civilizations that appear in these genealogies are about a story that God has, brought to bear. And the story that God has brought to bear is going to end up giving this tiny little nation named Israel a God-given understanding of the world around them that they know. And the backstory that God has been orchestrating all along, and how God has destined them to actually reach these nations around them that have grown apart from God. That's the story, and that's the backstory, and it was all for Israel's doing, because we got to remember that Genesis is largely just Moses, the answer that God gives to Moses when Moses says at the burning bush, hey, who are you, and who should I tell them is sending me? So Genesis is the answer to Moses' question, all of our questions. Who are you, God? Well, and who are we really when it comes down to it? And where are we? Good worldview questions. What's the problem? What's the solution? That's the kind of thing that the Bible is after in its opening scenes with Genesis chapter 1 the whole way through Genesis 11 now. And by the time we get done with Genesis 11, we're out of prehistory and into history. And that's what we're going to take a deep dive on and get our minds wrapped around. But like I said already, these two chapters are largely genealogies, man, tough reading. You know what I'm saying? And it hardly seems like it's edifying reading. And I would say it probably isn't edifying reading, but it is worth our investigation. If you have some, a few skills of observation and investigation, you can kind of put together some interesting, parts of the story. And that's what I hope to do, is help you to see some of the interesting parts of the story that are moving forward in these genealogies. So anyhow, Genesis chapter 10 and 11 turns to the genealogies to actually advance the story of the Adam's progress and redemption to the names of the nations. So what's basically happening here is that the Adam's progress and redemption is what these genealogies are all about. And these genealogies contain the names of people, but the names of those people are going to, evolve into the names of the nations, that exist right around 1500 BC. So Genesis 10 has long been nicknamed by anybody that really reads it as the Table of Nations. And there's some parallels with other, cultures of the world to this Table of Nations. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But Genesis 10's Table of Nations, as it will unveil, expresses the kinship and the distinctions of the nations that surround this newly emerging group that we call the Hebrews and will eventually turn into Israel. The Hebrews will emerge as this tiny little obscure nation. And that's actually part of the story too, that God has absolutely no need for humankind's bombast and, just bravado. But anyhow, this tiny little nation of Israel is going to be destined by God to bless the nations all around Israel. And Israel will largely fail. There's no doubt, if you ever read the Old Testament, you know that Israel largely fails, except that from Israel will come Jesus and will become the true Israel that actually succeeds where Israel failed in blessing the nations. That's the big story, folks. That's the big story that starts in Genesis and ends in Revelation and is continually going on right now as we speak. There are Jesus people in all of the 193 nations of the world as we name them today, and that's good news. But there's four things about biblical genies, I'll call them, so I don't have to keep saying that mouthful of a word called genealogies. Biblical genies have, basically four things that we need to know about them in order to make good sense of them. First of all, biblical genies establish story continuity. That's the heavy load that they are bearing. Story continuity over long stretches of time where there is very little narrative or story going on. One of the things that biblical genies never do, and this would be point two, never do biblical genealogies even attempt to calculate the sum of time. I know that's disappointing for some people, but it just simply is not in the scope of what the genealogies are trying to do. What the genealogies are doing is story continuity, building a continuity over a large stretch of time without a story narrative for the most part. Thirdly, biblical genies employ artistry and literary skills. I know that's hard for us to imagine, but they do. First of all, the book of Genesis' first 10 chapters divide the history of Adam to Abraham, and they divide it into two equal parts, and the two equal parts are 10 generations each. And so there is an artistic flair going on in the selection of 10 generations from Adam to Noah, and then 10 more generations from Noah to Abraham. 10 ends up being kind of a biblical multiplier that signals the idea that it's a very big number, which means basically a lot of time has gone by. We see how Matthew treats genealogies, genies. Matthew opens his gospel up with an opening genealogy that divides history into three periods equally of 14 generations to form an artistic message. Matthew's very aware that the math simply does not work out to three periods of 14 generations that go from Jesus back to Abraham, but that what he's trying to do with his storyline or his artistic messaging is present the number 14 in as many ways as possible, because the number 14 also is the numerical value for the name of David. David is an instrumental king in the storyline who is told by God that he is going to make his son, a son of David, in the future, well, the bearer of God's promised blessing, who, spoiler alert, is Jesus. And so Matthew is using these genealogies to broadcast his, neon message that Jesus is the guy. He is the son of the woman we've been waiting for the whole book of the Bible. And fourthly, biblical genies demonstrate legitimacy of an individual of prominence of some sort by connecting the individual to a worthy family or a person of past importance. This is the part of genealogies that's fairly common in the Assyrian, Egyptian, and Babylonian tables of kings, who also skip many names just to get to the connection of significance that they want to get to. And so genies, basically in a biblical way, are found, here to advance the storyline. Genealogies in the table of kings, however, in other nations, are never found in religious texts, which is kind of interesting, that their religious texts never attempted genealogies, only in the table of kings in other nations. So anyhow, the Bible's pretty unique in this way. In Genesis chapter 10 through 11, its main goal is to demonstrate that a genealogy that connects up with Abraham to Shem to Noah to Seth to Enoch to the son of Eve, and this son of Eve that is destined to destroy the serpent, the promise that God had made that the son of Eve at some point in time is going to destroy the serpent, and the serpent represents evil, and that is the main story. The genealogies are carrying the story of God's plan to destroy evil. That's the big deal. Okay, so when it comes to Genesis 10 and 11, we're going to dive into the text, but we're not going to read all those crazy names. We're going to talk about Genesis 10 first, and then we'll talk about how it relates and connects up to Genesis 11. And there is a little bit of narrative along the way, and that little bit of narrative is going to be saying a lot more than we typically think. So anyhow, let's just look at some patterns and structures and some narrative or some genealogy artistry, so to speak. Genesis chapter 10 begins with 7 sons. Okay, so this word or phrase, sons of, occurs 7 times up to Nimrod. And then at the end of Genesis chapter 10, we find this sons of in another numerical 7 after Ham. We also find the 7 sons of Japheth. We find the 7 grandsons of Gomer and Jova. And so 7 ends up being this kind of biblical flash number of God's perfection, or at least something very good when it comes to the number 7. Why? Because of the 7 days of creation that we find in the first chapter of the Bible. So the number 7 carries some literary and artistic weight to it. And so Genesis chapter 10 is flashing this number 7 all over the place. But one can't help but to notice that the middle section of Genesis 10, that little section that covers Nimrod through Canaan, involves random numbers. And when it involves random numbers, whenever all of the other parts of Genesis 10 keeps coming back to 7s, well, we get a biblical clue that there's a problem that we're going to need to be aware of. So that's what we have so far, in kind of an overall, using genealogies and numbers to kind of flash and signal that there's an important message here too. We'll get to more of that in a second. But then we get a little bit of narrative, and the narrative goes like this. Nimrod, he was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was the mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Okay, so there's some clues that you need in this. The name Nimrod means we shall rebel. Right. So Nimrod means we shall rebel. And here, the word mighty man that is used in the text actually means tyrant. And the word mighty hunter actually means, well, it doesn't mean anything other than mighty hunter. But it's clear, if you read the rest of the Bible, that this is no shepherd king that we're looking at. This Nimrod that emerges onto the scene is a mighty man, a mighty hunter, who has on his lips, we shall rebel. But also notice that this is all before the Lord, giving us a very clear understanding that this rebellion of Nimrod is completely under the watch of God. He notices, he gets it. That's the main message. But anyhow, Genesis chapter 10, as it rolls out to us, includes this table of 70 nations. And so Genesis chapters 1 through 11 includes this number 10, 10 generations from Adam to Noah, 10 generations from Noah to Abe. And then we consider all the 7s that are being flashed about. And there forms an artistic rendering of this numerical value of 70, the 70 nations that are listed in Genesis chapter 10. And I think the easiest way to see the message that's being flashed is that these nations have actually grown under God's sovereignty, that there is no such thing as a nation apart from God. All of these nations, despite their rebellious behaviors or apartness from God, are actually under God's sovereignty, his watchfulness. Whether they acknowledge him or not doesn't matter to God. They are under his sovereignty. He has allowed them to grow. He has allowed them to, even prosper, even if they are not acknowledging him. And so these end up being, these 70 nations are Israel's, the future Israel's, bitter and bullish national neighbors that emerge. Egypt and Babel in particular, later Babylon, correctly have one foot in this story in prehistory and one foot in history, which jives with the way we understand things as well. But the small narrative that comes up in Genesis chapter 10, verse 21 to, I think it's 27, this small narrative about Eber and Eber's sons. So Eber gets a lot of attention here because Eber has two sons, and the two sons' names that he gives are the name Joktan and the name, it's escaping me, Peleg. So Joktan and Peleg are Eber's two sons, but the names Joktan and Peleg mean watch and division. So Joktan means watch, Peleg means division. And so what we are watching for is a big division that is coming up. So again, it's this little, sign in the genealogy saying, uh-oh, something big happens and there's a big division. Watch out for that, which is going to lead us to the city and Tower of Babel story, which is where we go next. So we're moving right along. Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11, it's here where the division that was just signaled to us is elaborated on. Here's the division that you were looking for. And so let's just read that famous Babel story. And it goes like this. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower with the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people. They have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech." And so the Lord dispersed them from over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, its name was Babel, because the Lord there had confused the language of all the earth. And from there, the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth. Well, the number one part of the story that kind of cracks me up is that the literal word one language in Hebrew actually is lip, one lip. So that cracks me up because I think everybody's mother said, "Don't give me any lip." And this is a whole passage about people giving God lip. I don't know, cracks me up. Maybe you don't find it too funny, but I find it hilarious. But the whole passage, too, is really about what man says and what God says. It's a story of words and actions, man's words and God's words, man's actions, God's actions. And it's interesting that the word "the whole earth" comes up 4 times, which means that it is a story that everybody needs to pay attention to. There's nobody excluded from this story. The whole earth is making it very clear that no matter where you are or who you think you are, this story is for you. And basically, what do we have? After the flood, after the flood, what do we have? We have the rise of the Cityites. So here we have, people, consorting together. They're going to build another big city, and it is an absolute riotous affair. It is actually a dig against God. It's the rise of the Cityites, the idiots from the city. Again, we saw this rise of the Cityites before the flood, and now we see this rise of the Cityites again after the flood. And when the Bible previously talked about Nimrod being one of the first mighty man on earth, we're probably talking about after the flood. And here we go again, the rise of the Cityites. And what is the cry of the Cityites? We want our own identity. How hilarious is that? With our day and age around us, right? We want our own identity. We don't want God's identity. image of us, not image of God. Our plans, not God's plans. Hallowed be my name, not hallowed be thy name, meaning God's name. Our accomplishments make us great. God's accomplishments? Who cares? Who cares? Because God must see how great we really are. I don't know about how much of this you connect up with. I connect up with it an awful lot. I literally thought in my younger days that when God does look down on me, he must think I'm a fantastic, great guy. I never need God and he doesn't have to do anything for me, was my attitude. And I was exactly like this Babel group. I had the same bombast going for me for about 28 years. Now, people thought I was a nice guy, but in my heart of hearts, man, I was all me. I wanted my own identity, nobody else's. Well, anyhow, then there's God's point of view. And God actually doesn't disagree with them being great. He says, you are great. You are great because I made you great. I made you to be great. And you are confused. And that's where the word Babel comes into an interesting play. The word Babel actually means confused. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But God says, I will really confuse your confusion, and I will change your language up so that you really are confused. And God makes it very clear that what they mean for evil, God actually means for good. He actually puts a damper on their parade, I know, but actually, remember, God gave a command to Noah to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, just like he had given to Adam and Eve. And it is this plan that God is going to get his way over. He's going to change their language up so that they can't get along, so that they have to move away. And so, yes, there is progress. God is going to get his way. But on the bigger question, what about the progress for redemption? Because this group seems terrible, just terrible. Well, God's going to have to intervene in that, and that's what the story is about. He has a plan to intervene in all of this. God will use something very tiny to show his significance, and that's what's very interesting here, is that man and man's bombast is always thinking that that's what it takes to be great and to have a great name. God's actually a big fan of using something tiny and insignificant because he doesn't need the bombast. He doesn't need all the bravado. So God will use something very tiny to show his significance. And, well, we're kind of left with God saying, I will get my way, despite how loudly you sing Frank Sinatra's song, My Way. And it is a story of our way versus God's way. The whole Bible is a story of our way versus God's way. Two ways to live is all the Bible. God sees life for us as two ways to live, our way or God's way. Well, anyhow, what is hilarious is this name Babylon. To the Babylonians, the name Babylon, or the sound, that phonetic sounding of a word that Babylon has, to them, Babylon means gateway to the gods. But to the Hebrews, the word Babylon means great confusion. And even in our English, we use the word Babel to describe a great confusion of words and ideas. And this, the other thing that's hilarious is this giant tower into the heavens that they're building is so low that God has to come down. That is biblical humor. That is hilarious. This giant tower that they are building for themselves to get into the heavens with, well, God has to come down to it. It's still a little on the low side. Anywho, we are confused. So then Genesis chapter 11, verse 10 ends with a very long genealogy. And the only real highlight here is that we do hear about Eber's son, but this time we're going to hear about Eber's son Peleg. And we're not going to hear any mention of Joktan. And I'll tell you why in a second. But by the time we get to chapter 11, verse 31, we are firmly in the grasp of history. History that the people of Moses is going to, that group of people that Moses is about ready to take out of Egypt is now in a place where they recognize the names of these nations. So the storyline for them had been just as unrecognizable as it would be for us. But all of a sudden, by the time we get to the end of Genesis chapter 11, all of the names that have been said are becoming very familiar to them. They get it. They get that this is about the place that they live and what they're about to do. And we also get it with a little help from archaeology. We found those Assyrians. In the 1700s, people were even doubting that the Assyrians even existed, except, well, the Bible said they did, and some guys got to scratching around in the dirt, and lo and behold, found those Assyrians. And, well, now you can go to college and study the Assyrians. Well, anyhow, the numbers 7 and 10 and 70, that table of nations, end up forming part of the big message here, that all of the nations are under God's watch. All of them. There isn't a nation on the planet that is outside of God's watch. Nations are under God's watch and his plan. And Israel itself will be God's tiny little nation for the progress of actually redeeming the nations. God's going to make a nation out of one man. Yeah, God doesn't need all this bombast. He's going to make a nation out of one man for his own name's sake. And God's desire in selecting this one man, his name's Abraham, God's desire is to redeem all people, from all nations, because all nations are under God's sovereignty and everyone needs redemption. That's what we get out of this. Genesis 10 and 11 is making this clear, even though it's in the hard yards of some genealogies. The last half of Genesis 11 emphasizes God's redemption because it emphasizes that, in the face of Babel, where it seems that Nimrod ends up, and maybe Joktan ended up there too, but God's plan of redemption is actually going through Peleg. No mention of Joktan. Peleg to Abraham, God's tiny hero that will carry God's promise. That's the storyline that we're following. The 70 nations, if we keep reading the story further, their hope is going to be in the 70 sons of Jacob, the 70 elders of Israel, and the nation of Israel itself. Now, even though Israel fails, don't miss it whenever Jesus commissions 70 of his own disciples to go out with God's words and actions in Luke's gospel, I think somewhere around chapter 10. But the story for us all, right here in Genesis 10 and 11, is unity gone wild. Unity gone absolutely sideways. Unity is not always good. One titanic collective rebelling against God. That's the story of Babel. And their strength is in the unity of their language. And it will be mankind that will misuse this unifying language about us for racism. Racism is all man's doing, and it usually always begins with somebody who speaks a different language and then moves into different skin colors and all of that. Racism is 100% man's doing. God will have none of it. The table of 70 nations are of one blood. That is the point that is being made. One blood under God. All of them are in the image of God. Their ethnic divisions, their geographic divisions, their linguistic divisions, their political differences don't make anybody better than anybody else. There is only one question for every person, no matter what nation you're living in, and that is, which way do you want to live? Our way, your way, or God's way? That's it. And out of this passage too, gives us a pretty clear biblical definition of sin. And that is, the Bible defines sin as ignore God's commands, try to make a name for yourself, and think that somehow you can make your own way into the heavens. And I would say, we haven't changed a bit. We prove the Bible right every day. The world around me proves the Bible right every day. I prove the Bible right every day. Everyone needs redemption. Everyone needs what God is offering. And that is the broadcast message. And God's got a handle on this story of redemption. Take a look at the tiniest thing to find this story of redemption. Well, more on that as we move forward, but we're going to end our time right there. Thanks for hanging out. It's always good to be with you.